Richard Marles for more on this and other topics of the day. Richard, thank you for your time. What is this going to cost, your 2050 net zero emissions target?
Well, really, Annalise, the question of cost is one better now directed to the government. The question is, what is going to be the cost to the economy if we don't act? We've got a report from the CSIRO which is saying that moving to a position of net zero emissions by 2050 will see an increase in wages, it will see an increase in economic growth, we'll see a decrease in power prices. You've got Melbourne University in the last week have just made the point that the cost of inaction is something like 20 times that of acting. Net zero emissions by 2050,
so
at the end of the day,
how do you compare the cost of inacting as being 20 times more than acting if you don't know what the acting cost is?
Well, I'm just citing modelling that's been done by the University of Melbourne. But let's be clear about this. Net zero emissions by 2050 is at the heart of the Paris Accord. I mean, that's really what those commitments are about. If you're going to keep climate change to 2 degrees, then what everybody is saying is that means net zero emissions by the middle of the century. That is what this government has signed up to. And in a sense, they're trying to walk both sides of the street, because on the one hand, they're saying they're meeting all their Paris commitments, and on the other side, they're saying something as standard and basic and globally mainstream as this is a step too far. But the fundamental point is, if it really is the government's position that they don't intend to get here, given that there is a cost in not getting here, how is the government going to pay for that?
The cost, though, is a global cost, isn't it? We single-handedly cannot change what happens to emissions around the globe. So the cost is as a result of everybody's carbon emissions. Our cost for what we're going to do is just controlled by us. So one can be controlled by us, one can't. That's true, isn't it, in terms of the cost of not acting?
No, that's not quite the right logic, Tom, because by the middle of the century, we will have a global economy which is going to penalise carbon. And so to continue with business as usual in Australia through the course of the first half of this century will mean that our economy specifically, quite apart from what's happening in terms of emissions reduction globally, will carry a cost with it. And that's really the point here. But let's be clear, that we are talking about building renewable energy. That involves investment, private sector investment, which equals economic activity, economic growth, it equals jobs. That's what we're talking about. And this really is a goal that is being talked about today. Of course, there needs to be medium-term steps between now and then, and there's a long way to the election, and we will be detailing all of that prior to the election. But as a direction of where we need to go, which is that we need to be true. If we're fair income about signing up to Paris, which apparently this government's done, well then that's what this means. And what we're doing is, in a sense, making that very plain and saying this is where we need to go as a nation.
So when you talk about costs, you're citing various bodies and what they've estimated will be the cost of action versus inaction today. Last election, you cited a couple of different studies around what 45% would cost, but you didn't do your own costs or modelling on that. Will that change this time for the shorter term, the 2030 or 2035 target? Is that going to be something you present with your own modelling and details?
Well, we will. There's quite a way between now and the election, and as we've said many times in relation to many policies, we're going to take our time to get those right. But you'll see across the board, in terms of all the policies that we put to the Australian people at the next election, costed ways forward, but that's a way off. Right now, it's important. And I think the country is crying out for a clear statement of direction as to where as a nation we need to go. And that's what this statement
might be. That will be firmly costed by Labor. It won't be the same situation we saw last time that was, well, here are some studies, here are what some organisations think that will cost.
Well, it's hard to answer the question fully because we don't know where the country will be come the election. In a sense, we don't know what damage this government's going to do over the next 2 years.
So whatever target you take, you can still take the principle of costing it.
We will be taking detailed policies to the next election. You can be sure of that, and we are going to take our time to get that right. Today, It is an important statement of principle about where we need to head as a nation. And net zero emissions by the middle of the century is, at the end of the day, where the developed world is going, and it is what the Paris Accord represents. And we as a nation have signed up to that. And certainly Labor as a party supports it. And consistent with that, you get this policy, and I think it's a very important statement that's made in Australia today.
To the election, if you're taking that specific target to the election, why can you not at the same time specifically say that you will take the cost of that target to the election too?
Well, what with getting to a place of net zero emissions by 2050 is what all the science says needs to be done in order to keep climate change to 2 degrees. And that's what's at the heart of the Paris...
No, we understand your policy and why you're saying that, but why wouldn't you commit to the cost of it by the election as well?
Sure. If I can complete the answer, Annalise. That's what Paris is about. We're talking about a state of affairs 30 years from now. It is a long-term goal. And in part that answers the question that you're saying in relation to costing. Now, there are people who have done a range of modelling around that. I think what we can say right now, as best you can, looking 30 years out, is that right now the cost of doing nothing looks like it is a lot more than the cost of trying to get to net zero emissions by 2050. Now, in terms of a shorter range or a closer range target, we'll deal with all of that in the lead up to the election.
Okay.
And you can be sure that we'll have detailed policies at that time.
Is this more a mission statement than a set, hard and fast, concrete target?
Oh, it's where all the science says that the world needs to be by the middle of the century if we're going to limit climate change or increases in global warming to 2 degrees. And so we're firmly committing to doing that. And that's what the Paris Accord is about. And I think the point that really needs to be asked of the government here, and we can talk about whatever we're going to be taking to 2022. Right now, in February 2020, it is the government which has the reins of power, and they need to be acting right now. We have, the sense of the cost of inaction could not be more palpable to the Australian people after the summer that we've just had than people are experiencing. And really the question needs to be asked of the government, how are they going to deal with all of that? And to sit and pretend that we can do nothing over the next 30 years and kind of present an economy in 2050 as it is now, as if we would be living now like we were in 1990, 30 years ago, is patently ridiculous. But that's the kind of reaction that we've already seen this morning from the government in relation to the policies that we're talking about. This
Richard
equals
Marles, we're running
jobs.
out of time. We just wanted to get your thoughts too on the Tyndall Air Base, government putting $1.6 billion into upgrading it. They've specifically said it's for our partnership with the United States because there are Marines based there. Is this a good time to be doing it when we have such tense relationship with the Chinese at the moment, with travel bans, with all of the trade implications that come from the coronavirus, to then be backing in a greater US presence in the Indo-Pacific?
What we do in relation to big investments of this kind are really pursuing a course which is set over decades. Tyndall is a really important air base. It was actually established under the Hawke Labor government and under the Gillard government in 2012. We made a point in the Force Posture Review then that a greater emphasis needed to be placed on Tyndall, and of course it was the Gillard government which set up the Marine rotation with the US Marines in that same year when President Obama visited Australia at that time. I think a greater engagement with the United States in East Asia is really important. We need to keep America engaged in this part of the world, and this is a good step forward in terms of doing that. It continues really the agenda that Labor has been setting over the course of decades. I think one other point to be made is...
Yeah.
Go on, Tom.
All right, sorry, I just wanted to get on this finally. You might wrap your final point in this if you like, but do you see this as a sign of a more assertive Australia-US alliance, and is it the right call even if China raises the usual objections?
I definitely think this enhances our alliance with the United States. I think it is important that Australia is more assertive in global affairs now. I think we do face the the most challenging set of strategic circumstances that we have since the Second World War, a point that a number of us have been making over some time. And part of that is about keeping the United States engaged in East Asia. As I said, the point I was going to make is it really does matter that we are, in terms of the Australian Defence Force, committed to the north and committed to Darwin. We've seen under this government moving a significant part of one brigade from Darwin down to Adelaide. We actually need to be investing in the top end, and so to that end, this investment is good.
All right, Richard Marles, always appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks, Annalise.